Welcome to the June edition of The Coffee House, where in the next hour, it's back in the headlines. But what's all the fuss about the designer drug Ecstasy? We'll find out on Coffee House Forum. Also, coping with asthma, every breath you take. That's on In Sickness and in Health. Rita Clark and her crew of Renegades play some Nolan sounds on musical traditions. And on Writer's Block, NPR's Ray Suarez takes us back to the old neighborhood. Plus, a DJ Renegade poem, the song and dance calendar, and the top 10 lists for book sales and video rentals. Hi, and welcome to the Coffee House. Imagine that the entire population of Philadelphia was in prison. They're not, of course, but right now in the U.S. there are around 1.6 million people behind bars, and that's roughly the population of Philly or Houston, and it's about 3 times the number of Americans who were behind bars in 1988. Now that's a growth industry. And driving this growth are incarcerations for illegal drugs, either selling or possessing them. In the 60s, the attention was on marijuana and psychedelics like LSD. The 70s saw the rise of powder cocaine. And while crack cocaine may have been the drug of choice in the ghetto in the 80s, another drug was then gaining popularity among some middle-class users, both for therapy and recreation. And it's recently burst into the headlines again in the form of an early May Fox News hidden camera report depicting apparent drug use by teens at a rave dance party on Capitol Hill, even as moonlighting cops looked on. That report was soon followed by news that the popular rave drug MDMA, better known as Ecstasy, was not illegal in the District of Columbia due to a legal loophole. The D.C. Council quickly sealed that loophole, and then on May 12th came this news.
Police have made their biggest bust ever when it comes to the drug Ecstasy. More than 700 tablets of the drug were recovered from a home in Rockville last night. That has a street value of $14,000. Police also recovered 3 pounds of marijuana, psychedelic mushrooms, and $8,000 in cash. 13 people were inside the home on Wren Street at the time of the raid. 10 were arrested, including 2 juveniles.
Given all the renewed attention to Ecstasy, the love drug, we thought we'd look behind the hype, pro and con. First, what is it?
The initials stand for methylene dioxymethylamphetamine, and it's a compound that is an amphetamine derivative, and it works, as does amphetamine, by being taken up into nerve cells and displacing our own neurotransmitters. That is, it works because it makes more dopamine and serotonin available to postsynaptic, post-neural effector cells. So it's a compound that mimics our own transmitters, and it does it in such a fashion that people find it positive and use it for that purpose.
Is MDMA a psychedelic drug?
You know, psychedelic is a term that's hard to define, but the best answer I can give to you is very few people have hallucinations on MDMA. They have a positive feeling. They feel very good and very happy and very willing to relate to people. They're very energized because it has an amphetamine effect, and as you know, young people may dance great hours after taking it, but people rarely, if ever, hallucinate. So it's not psychedelic in the sense that LSD is, but it is psychedelic in the sense that people feel great self-confidence. They feel very little self-consciousness. This is one of the reasons why therapists tried to use it. Underground psychiatric therapists tried to use it in the 70s and 80s because people were open, felt they could be honest, felt that they could communicate very well because they felt so good.
Does it sexually excite the user?
I don't know that it excites people sexually, but it's certainly, people have told me that they feel so good and so positive about other people that it sort of easily and automatically leads to sexual contact, particularly if you take it with someone whom you care about deeply. I don't think it really merits much of a reputation as an aphrodisiac. On the other hand, it does raise your pulse, raise your blood pressure a little bit, gives you a feeling of alertness and excitement, and maybe that does lead to sexual exploration.
I've heard just the opposite from some people.
There are some people who would say quite the opposite. In fact, a good friend of mine once said to me that once he takes the drug, or early on when he takes the drug, he feels very sexy and would like to get his clothes off, and then after a few minutes, he would much rather talk and much rather have a different kind of relationship, even if he's with a woman who might have attracted him sexually. So yeah, for some people it does move the other way.
The initial use of ecstasy in the 1970s was by therapists, according to a study conducted for the government's National Institute of Drug Abuse. Then, in the early 80s, some entrepreneurs found a market for ecstasy among recreational users.
They began to mass produce it and distribute it basically all over the country, mostly in Texas and also in California and in Boston. And sure enough, it was a drug that became popular with people who were not so interested in psychotherapy, but interested in using it in more of a club scene, a dance scene, and mostly in Dallas in the early to middle 80s. And at that time, it was actually used by affluent, white. It just is a white drug. I mean, that's it. At least up until recently, it has been. People who would go out. They called it. They called it clubbing then too, on Friday and Saturday night in Dallas. So it became very popular, and in fact, you could buy it in bars in Dallas using a credit card. And they had clubs, dance clubs, all set up for people who would dance all night. They would serve them a lot of water, and they actually, some of these clubs installed like handles, so people could just hang on and kind of rock back and forth. I mean, they were so anyway. But at that point, it became pretty famous, and also the DEA started to learn about it, and it became illegal in quite short order as soon as it became well known, and it became illegal in 1985. It was put into Schedule 1.
Schedule 1 means that, legally speaking, MDMA is treated like heroin or LSD. It's flat out illegal.
There are a number of people who would like to study the drug in a conventional medical sense. Dr. Grobe, who's in Los Angeles, has tried very hard to give the drug to individuals with severe pain and individuals who are facing death, because he thinks, by what he knows about the drug, that people would achieve relief and feel good and have perhaps some pain relief. So he's applied through very conventional channels to use the drug as a therapeutic agent, and there are many people who would like to do that, and there's certainly no reason why that cannot be true. So the answer to your question is it should not be a Schedule 1 drug, or rather it should certainly be available for study. So some of these questions of its potential therapeutic use could be examined.
Not that criminalization has stamped out enthusiasm for ecstasy. The government estimates that some 1 to 2 million people use the drug each year. But are they really getting MDMA?
We did a study, the nonprofit MAPS, and we analyzed samples from around the country of MDMA. What we found is that of the pills that were sold as MDMA, half of them were completely and totally bogus, had no MDMA in them whatsoever. But the things that they did have in them were like ephedrine, pseudoephedrine, various cold preparations, things like that, that wouldn't necessarily cause a problem, but that are not really MDMA. The powders we found were almost uniformly genuinely powders, which is surprising because you kind of expect that powders would be more likely to be cut. But I think that's because the manufacturers who manufacture the pills are more involved in the wholesale drug distribution business. They're more likely to do it in an illegal context, and they'll press pills or whatever and put it out on the market. But the people who tend to make the powders are sort of home chemists who do it, and perhaps have more of a sense that they want to put out a pure product.
Just what are the risks?
The ones that have been proved, particularly in the Rave setting, it raises the body temperature a little bit, and some people have sweated and not kept up with their fluid consumption, so it's actually been associated with heat stroke, particularly when the club was very hot and when the young person, danced for a long time and didn't consume enough food. Now, heat stroke is a very, very serious illness, and there have been deaths in which there's loss of bodily fluid, blood concentration, breakdown of muscle tissue, failure of kidneys. So heat stroke is the most important issue. In the United Kingdom, there have been some deaths due to severe liver failure, but that hasn't happened in the United States. So people have speculated this might be due to a contaminant or something in the production, which is not exactly MDMA. There have been a few case reports of people with cardiac arrhythmias because the drug will increase heart rate and will stimulate the heart. Now, all of these are important. Obviously, the heat stroke is important because it may cause death. But of late, most all of the attention has been given to the fact that in animal species, drugs that are indirectly acting on serotonergic and dopaminergic membranes cause damage to serotonin membranes, serotonin cells, in certain concentrations. So at this moment, everyone's engaged in a furious debate as to whether the doses humans take may be associated with this brain toxicity, which is easily seen in animals. And that's what everybody's talking about now. And it's unresolved, although I would say, as a conservative physician, that there's no question that the damage that they're talking about does occur in animals. The question is whether human consumption at a high dose level might produce the same kind of brain damage. We don't quite know what the brain damage might cause, but it does occur in animals.
But Dr. Morgan fully expects that many people, including young people, will experiment with ecstasy despite the possible risks. So he has some advice.
Start low, go slow, but do it with a friend. You know, illegal drugs are dangerous because you never know the dose. So you need to take small amounts. You need to go very slowly. You need to protect yourself. You need not to be in a car. You need not to enter into marital contracts. You need not to babysit when you're under the influence of a drug. So those are things that young people need to know.
And to avoid dehydration, drink lots of water and stay away from alcohol. While the jury is still out on the long-term health effects of ecstasy, the evidence to date is scant that the drug has been abused. And that's true for recreational as well as therapeutic use.
Because of the nature of the population of people using it, which was mostly middle and upper middle class people who basically had their lives in order, we found very little negatives, very little abuse. Also, people learned that the more they used it, the less positive effect it had. So that they would take care to space their trips to 2-3 months apart. So we found that as a drug of abuse, it really didn't turn out to be much of a drug of abuse because there was no tolerance. The more you did, the less effect it had. And people knew that in order to get the effect, they just had to stop using it for a while. And so we found that there was a little bit of binge use. Most people came out of that pretty quickly.
And despite his questions about the long-term health effects of MDMA, Dr. Morgan is more worried about a government that subsidizes the use of some dangerous chemicals and bans others.
As a young pharmacologist, I was very taken by the fact that the FDA did good things for us. It protected us from some toxic agents. It protected us from hasty marketing of some toxic agents. And so I've always viewed some of the FDA rigors and rules for therapeutic substances as the good thing. But I've come in recent years to believe that when the government decides to operate against a drug because it regards the taking of that drug as a vice and decides to prohibit it, that leads us to very, very bad things. So my answer is quite clearly, there should be no possibility of going to jail for the taking and the holding of small amounts of any substance that humans wish to take.
Clearly, Dr. Morgan's view is not shared by law enforcement in the area, but just as clearly, a significant number of people won't be deterred from experimenting with ecstasy just because it's illegal. Hopefully, those who do use ecstasy will use it wisely. Still to come, breathing easier about asthma, the New Orleans sounds of Rita Clark and her crew of Renegades, and Public Radio's Talkmeister Ray Suarez. But first, DJ Renegade.
Jazz in 4/4 time. 1. If Dizzy Gillespie had been a poet, he'd compose a tune in the key of to be. Something like, what it is what it is, because if what it was what it be, then what it be simply cannot. But it be beep, 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 bop. 2. Dust slow dances through the lights of Carnegie Hall. Lady Day clings to the edge of a song. Her pain pulled into a tight ponytail. Voice run off with a younger woman. Eyes swollen from living in the narrow of a needle. Strange fruit falling from her lips. 3. Coltrane's fingertips trek across the brass tracks of his tenor sax. Riding 3 rails as one, he clucks his tongue, licks sweat from the sweet neck of sound. While he solos his song, the piano covers him in a plush robe of notes, while he searches for a riff that fits, like the name of the Lord on the lips of a frightened child. 4. Miles was one deep black bucket, black and mysterious as floating smoke, black as a patch of sky around midnight, black as the kettle that stewed a bitch's brew, black and turning like a new tire for miles ahead. Miles was so black he was kinda blue. Miles was slick as black ice, cool as black snow, sweet as black cherries on a downbeat like a blackjack. That's a black Jack Johnson, a black Jack Hammer, a black Jack of all trumpeting trades. Miles, the Jack of spades, was our ace, cause he played night colors. Like deep black, triple black, shiny black, center black, ashy black, quarter black, multi-black, mega black, all shades of Miles, shifting harmonic gears in his chromatic Ferrari, blowing blue moves with his black turn to the audience, speaking coolly in the colors of night.
Hi, and welcome to In Sickness and in Health. Breathing, it's the first thing we do after birth, even before that anxiously awaited cry. Breathing should be easy, but for millions of people, including some infants, it's not. These are asthma sufferers, and they must take special steps to ensure their lungs keep working. Asthma can kill. It can hit at any age, and there's evidence it's sneaking up on many more people than ever before. Some people have asthma but don't know it. Here to talk about signs of asthma, what to do about it, and medical research into the disease are Ruth Quartey, Research Project Director at Howard University's College of Medicine, and Linda Borschuk, asthma patient and board member of the Asthma and Allergy Foundation's Maryland branch. Welcome both of you to the Coffee House. First of all, how do we know we have asthma? There are a lot of people, perhaps even 10% of the American population, who may have it and don't know. Perhaps you'd like to begin, Ruth?
Yeah, well, asthma is a chronic lung inflammation. Primarily, it affects the airways. There are about 14 to 15 million Americans who suffer from asthma. Out of this between the 14 and 15 million people, about 5 million of them are children, 18 years and under. And this is characterized usually by coughing, wheezing, chest tightness, and shortness of breath. So any of these symptoms, will indicate that.
What kind of coughing? Is there a special sound to it, or?
Well, it has to be characterized by wheezing. Yeah, wheezing is associated with the coughing. It's usually nighttime coughing. It really wakes people up during the nighttime so that they have nocturnal type coughing and wheezing, as well as during the daytime. Yeah.
And it would be when they don't have some other bug that they can attribute it to.
Right, yeah.
There's also some kind of genetic link, is there not? Linda,
yes,
you have
in our family, I have 3 children and they all have asthma, and it's because I have asthma. And I have a husband that has some allergies, and just about everybody in my family, my parents, my brothers, my grandparents, there's a very strong history of asthma and allergies.
If you're in doubt about whether you have it or not, I suppose go to your doctor. That's the best thing, although there's perhaps misdiagnosis also of asthma by doctors.
Yeah, I think what we've come across is nobody's in a real hurry to diagnose you with asthma, especially an infant. So when my first child developed asthma, we didn't rush right to the allergist and get it treated right away. We did a lot over the phone with the pediatrician because a lot of the asthma occurred at night, and by the time daytime came around, he was feeling better. So you thought, oh, this must be okay, but by the time I got him to an allergist, I think he was about 3.5, and he'd been coughing and wheezing fairly regularly since he was 10 months old. And by the time he was 3.5 years old, he was pretty sick. So it took us a while to get his asthma under control, but we learned a lot.
And some people perhaps wouldn't know they have it, or the children's parents wouldn't know they have it until they're rushed to the emergency room really struggling for breath, and it can be a sort of life and death.
It's usually associated with either chronic bronchitis. That's what most people term it to be, chronic bronchitis or just a common cold. So it's good to go to the doctor and be diagnosed. They have to run different tests. They do lung function testing as well as skin testing to be able to diagnose that. But most people just say, oh, it's just a common cold or chronic bronchitis.
Or, with the genetic link with the parents having asthma, when I was growing up, there wasn't a whole lot they did to treat asthma. You didn't have a whole lot to offer. So when I had my children, I didn't know what there was out there to offer my children in the way of relief. So once I found out, though, that there was actually medicine that worked for children, it opened up this whole new world of health for us.
Are people doomed if they get asthma? I mean, it sounds so horrendous to think of struggling for breath, but can you outgrow it? Can you have just one attack and it goes away? Or is it something that's controlled more or less through your life?
It has to be under control. The thing is, most people tend to say that they have outgrown their asthma. No, it's just the fact that they have become less exposed to a particular trigger, something that they may be allergic to. Now, there are different types of allergens and irritants that trigger an asthmatic attack. So generally, when people move away from that kind of environment where they're no longer exposed to a particular allergen or irritant, they feel like the asthma is gone away. It's simply under control. Management entails taking the medication, being compliant with the medication, and having lung function testing done, and monitoring the disease on a regular basis. This way you can keep the disease under control.
Isn't there a chance it might change in children? Perhaps some children do actually outgrow it as well as moving away from the allergens. Or at puberty, sometimes some people, you were saying, get it worse. Sometimes it does disappear.
Well, sometimes it gets better, sometimes it gets worse. In our family, we have one that got better and we have one that got worse. And I think it was just because my older son just was exposed to what he was allergic to much more frequently that we were unaware of at his school. So I think when I deal with a lot of people that have children that have asthma, they're just diagnosed, and we always say that the first year is the hardest because you have to go through all the seasons and get exposed, figure out what all your triggers are that first year, and it's usually takes about a year. And then after that, you know what you're doing, you're educated finally, and you feel confident in being able to manage the allergens. And you do better at controlling your environments so that you're not triggered all the time, so that you're healthier more often than you're sick.
What are some of the triggers? I mean, there are many, many of them, aren't there? More than most people would imagine. Can you talk briefly about some of them?
Yeah, it could be allergens such as mold, pollen, dust mites, cockroaches, animal dander, even food allergies, all these things. And the cold weather, also extreme weather conditions can also trigger asthmatic attacks. So those are the types of things, either the outdoor allergens or indoor allergens, all those things. And then there's the genetic component as well. It is hereditary to some people. So those are the triggers, those things that cause the asthma the most.
And I suppose for some people they may have been living with a dog and had no problem, and then asthma begins, and it doesn't seem realistic that your dog could set you off. But
it took us about 4 years to figure out that our dog was a big trigger for our son. He was skin testing negative still, and he didn't seem to have a problem when the dog was in the house, but when we went away for 2 weeks and the dog was left in the house and we came home, he immediately started coughing when we walked in, and we sent the dog away for a month, cleaned out the house, and then we went to pick the dog up and he started coughing right away. It was definitely the dog. And he wasn't sick all the time, but when he got sick, he got really sick, and it was because he had no room to go once he was exposed to something else.
Now, asthma is going up, isn't it? Pollution, obviously, is one factor behind it, and in children as well. Can we explain what's going on, or do they not really know?
Well, nobody really knows the cause of asthma per se. They know the factors, some of the determining factors of asthma, and some of them are the things that I had previously mentioned, those things that people get exposed to, either the indoor allergens or the outdoor allergens, and then the irritants, even perfume. you know, strong cologne or maybe odors, you know, all these things do trigger people's asthma, you know. The prevalence is really high. From 1979 until present, you know, there have been about 60% increase in prevalence of asthma, and 14 to 15 million people are affected. And you see the prevalence mostly, it's very high in the African American population. Mortality rates have also increased. It's been about 4 times higher in African American population compared to the white population. So all these trends, you know, keep going up and up.
How many people die a year roughly?
About 5,000 people.
Every year?
Yeah, 5,000 people die of asthma every year.
And
yes.
what's, do they die because there's no way of treating them well enough, or they don't take their treatments, or they're caught?
All those factors, yes. People are either non-compliant with their medications, they're not being monitored, you know, on a regular basis, you know. Simple peak flow meter, you know, is a way to measure lung function.
Measure your puff.
Yes, how fast the air can be breathed out of their lungs, you know. And it's just like using the stethoscope or the blood pressure monitor to monitor people's blood pressure. You use a peak flow meter also. It's a simple device, you know, and Linda has one here. This is it, you know. They just have to use this on a daily basis.
Yes.
Usually, the physician will establish a baseline for the patient. And the patient is usually asked to monitor their lung function twice a day, in the morning and also in the evening time, over a 2 or 3 week period. And the physician will get this. It's usually recorded in a diary form.
So monitoring yourself is important. But
It
then
is
there
important.
are, nowadays, there are quite good drugs. Your family takes measures that...
Yeah, asthma is actually a very expensive disease to have. With 4 people with asthma in the family, our pharmacy bill has been as high as $25,000 a year. And now that we're all under control and nobody's been triggered frequently in our home, our pharmacy bill is down to $11,000. And our insurance doesn't cover that. That's out of our pocket. But, you know, I think part of the problem is that there are new medications all the time, and they're a little bit better than the ones before, and they're a little bit safer, and you want to go with the newest and the safest, and they're expensive. And there are some generics, but not for everything. Asthma management has come a long way very quickly.
And you can do sports, you can live a relatively, in fact, normal life with the right medications.
My youngest son had terrible asthma. He used to spend 3.5 months per year, every year, in the hospital. Missed most of first grade because he was so sick, and now he's in 3rd grade. He's on the boys gymnastics team, came in 2nd in the state. I mean, just amazing, and he's all muscle and works out 9 hours a week because his asthma is under control.
Does asthma shorten one's life?
Well,
just very briefly.
Right, it may shorten people's life, and that's why we have about 5,000 deaths per year. But the key to this also, with the different types of medications that there are 2 different types, you know, preventive medications and then rescue medications. The preventive medications are supposed to be used on a daily basis, you know, to prevent the asthma attack from coming on. The rescue medications are usually used to treat the asthma attack, right? So if people know the distinction between the 2 of them, they'll be able to manage their asthma better, so that they know they can take it all the time. Kids need to take their medicine before they go out to play. Otherwise, you know, the asthma flares up. Yes.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for now. A very big thank you to Ruth Quartey of Howard University's College of Medicine and Linda Borschuk of the Asthma and Allergy Foundation's Maryland branch for joining me in the coffee house. Hopefully, we'll all breathe a little easier now. I'm Cathy Kristiansen, and this has been In Sickness and in Health.
my chance. Yeah, you came in with my best friend Jim, and here I am, about to steal you away from him. Oh yeah, but if I don't do it, you know somebody else will. If I don't do it, yeah, somebody else will. If I don't do it, you know somebody else will. If I don't do it, yeah, somebody else will. And it's such a night, such a night. Sweet confusion under the moonlight, and it's such a night, yeah, such a night to steal away. Yeah, the time was right, and I couldn't believe my ears. Oh, my heart just skipped a beat when you said, "Come walking down the street." Yeah, you came in with my best friend Jim, and here I am, trying to steal you away from him. Oh yeah, but if I don't do it, you know somebody else will. If I don't do it, yeah, somebody else will. If I don't do it, yeah, somebody else will. If I don't do it, yeah, somebody else will. And it's
And such a night it is. I'd like to welcome back the crew of Renegades.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks for coming back on. That was a Dr. John tune.
Dr. John, indeed, yes.
Certainly one of the mainstays of the Louisiana,
Yes, he's definitely
New Orleans piano technique.
Absolutely. He's somewhat of a student of Professor Longhair and Alan Toussaint and all of them guys. They're terrific piano players.
You guys do just a amazing cross-cut of tunes. Who else do you do in, say, the piano players of the world?
Boy, Alan Toussaint.
Right.
James Booker.
We're getting some prompting over here from Alan.
Yes, because he knows I'm
That's right.
a little bit out there. Yeah, some Fats Domino, that sort of stuff.
Yeah. It's all dance music, too.
All dance music. You'll get your workout when you come hear us and dance to it.
What was the instrument you were playing? I mean, I know the answer to that, but, but we want to educate our viewing audience.
This is a traditional instrument of Louisiana. It's a frottoir, or rub board. And it's a lot of fun to play. It definitely steals the show every time I put it on.
Well, speaking of stealing the show, I recall that in the band's movie, The Last Waltz, the cut, Such a Night, was what Dr. John did. I'm going to try and put you guys on the spot. Since you do such a wide range of music, can you play something, say, by the band?
Sure can.
All right.
All right. Ophelia.
Well, that was wonderful. You know, that's one of the best things about being able to produce this show a little bit and work with you guys is that I get a little input into the songs, and it makes me feel good because there's some of my favorite tunes.
Great.
Speaking of favorite tunes, you guys have released a CD recently.
Yes, we did.
And I just happen to have one with me.
Imagine that.
And I'm even remembering to tilt it forward, so hopefully people sitting in their living rooms are not blinded by the light.
There you go.
Because it's a hot CD.
Yeah, we're real proud of it. We worked real hard on it, and we're just real proud with it, and we're really looking forward to doing the next one.
Give them the title.
It's called Mardi Gras Gumbo.
This is the shameless part of the show.
It's called Mardi Gras Gumbo, and you can purchase it at the House of Musical Traditions in Tacoma Park.
Thank you.
It just recently got picked up by Barnes & Noble in Bethesda, and you can also get it at our shows, and I'd like for people to get it from us directly.
You'll autograph it. I'm gonna flip it around now so they can see that in fact there's many band members.
Yes.
There's at least 5, and sometimes I've seen you go as high as 7 or 8 when you get a couple of the grandsons in there sitting in with horn section. I'm gonna flip it around again, driving my cameraman nuts, I'm sure. You do some original material too.
Yes, we do. We've been writing some really fun original material, and it's going to be the mainstay of the next recording project.
Why don't I put you on the spot again and say, hey, play us an original.
Okay, we'll do it.
Thanks again.
This is called Strolling Rampart.
Nation host Ray Suarez gets hosted on Writer's Block.
Welcome to Writer's Block. Before America moved to the suburbs, we lived in the old neighborhood. The local school was in walking distance, and so was the church, the synagogue, the grocery store. We slept with our doors unlocked, unafraid of city streets. We knew our neighbors, raised our kids, grew old, and retired in the same place. But then things changed. The notion of crime, of race and difference changed the feel of the old neighborhood. We abandoned big city problems for better schools and lower taxes, or so we told ourselves. But something got lost in the process. In our move to the suburbs, America lost a critical piece of its identity for good. In his book, The Old Neighborhood, What We Lost in the Great Migration, 1966 to 1999, Ray Suarez examines white flight, immigration, and cultural identity. He describes nostalgia for the old neighborhood in the face of generic suburbs, and he questions whether the massive exodus from big cities was really necessary. Ray Suarez is the host of National Public Radio's Talk of the Nation. He has worked as a journalist in radio, television, and magazines. A native of New York City, he now lives in Washington, D.C. The Old Neighborhood is his first book. Welcome to the Coffee House.
Great to be here.
So talk a little bit about this old neighborhood.
Well, it was a place built by the new century. Immigrants were pouring into Boston and Baltimore and New York and Chicago and Cleveland and St. Louis, and created a kind of life which I don't think the people then thought was a finite thing that just lasted for a certain term and then we were going to ring the curtain down on it. There were suburbs in America before the Second World War, but they were really for upper middle class people. They were for middle managers and executives. They were built along the new streetcar lines that led out of the city or the new commuter rail lines. And they didn't offer the kind of choices in housing that allowed large sections of the urban population to just pick up and go. So we did the best we could where we were and created some pretty nice places to live, and all of that started to unravel after the Second World War.
And why did it start to unravel then?
Well, a couple of things. Some of it was natural and was going to happen no matter what. We had put off getting married through 10 years of Great Depression and 6 years of World War. We had put off, those of us who were already married, didn't have children or didn't have as many children as we planned to have. After all, the other guy involved in the work of having children was in the Pacific or in Europe, or in the American South, in boot camp, or who knows where they were. They just weren't around to get you pregnant. You know, a lot of decisions, a lot of real life work of being a young adult just was postponed. Housing shortages in the cities were acute. Very little residential construction went on in the big cities during the Depression and the war. In the Depression, because few people had the nerve to invest. In the war, because a lot of the materials needed for a lot of construction just were in very short supply, as was the manpower, as was the capital. So there was this pressure cooker building up inside, and when millions of people got out of uniform and headed home, they found that their old neighborhoods didn't work for them very well. And that was the moment that the cities should have risen up and said, look, Mr. and Mrs. America, we're going to help you find housing, and we're going to embark on aggressive new programs to create newer places to live. But they didn't do it. So that first wave headed right out, because the only place where there was a lot of new housing were in the Levittowns or in the new towns that were growing up just over the city line.
I see. And at the same time, though, the cities were still intact for a brief period of time, right? And could you talk a little bit about what that was like, what those cities were like? You talk about neighborhoods and how they were individual versus how they may have changed recently.
Well, a lot of people remember that recent American past as being marked by a highly ethnic coding of residential space. So people say, oh, this is Bensonhurst, that was an Italian neighborhood. Oh, Midwood, that was a Jewish neighborhood. But in fact, those neighborhoods had many people living within their boundaries, were always very mixed places, and really were lent more of a flavor, a lilt, a cultural cast by the presence of large numbers of Irish, German Jews, whatever. What happened when we started to lose the old neighborhood was that urban neighborhoods started to turn one thing overwhelmingly, which they had never been before. Some people say, oh, well, what's the problem with neighborhoods that are all black? You know, we had all Italian, all Polish, all Hungarian neighborhoods. In fact, we never had that.
Oh, interesting.
And no neighborhoods were as heavily settled by the people who lived in them as black neighborhoods are black. No Italian neighborhood was ever as Italian as black neighborhoods became black. And part of this was because the ghetto walls were very high and very thick, which created artificial, tremendous demand for housing inside the ghetto. The housing was old, it was substandard, there wasn't a lot of capital available, there were no lending institutions in a lot of these neighborhoods. So the only thing you could do to improve your situation was to jump out over those walls or bust out of those walls, so that the next neighborhood to change would be the neighborhood just adjacent to the black belt. And that was what happened. They kept making a tactical retreat and saying, okay, we'll draw the new line here and let them move in here. So even though we pride ourselves on being good capitalists and free marketeers, the free market was never allowed to operate in real estate. And that's what created a lot of this flight, created the loss of hundreds of millions of dollars worth of equity. Families from Europe, right, but they had thought that their house was going to be their safety net, their repository of all the money that they had been putting into it through all those years. And many of them got left holding the bag, got left owning a house that was worth next to nothing. And who did they blame it on? Not the people who made it happen, but on the people who were arriving.
The black
and
folks who are moving in.
That's too bad.
Yeah. Well, you talk a lot about that in terms of several cities, and you focus on Chicago, for instance, and the South Side. Maybe
well, Chicago had a very peculiar history because Bronzeville, the old black belt, was more highly segregated than most similar neighborhoods in other cities, Cleveland, Detroit, Harlem in New York. Its boundaries were fixed, razor straight, and unchangeable. And unfortunately, that just created this terrible situation where when you finally had to let people out, just because there were too many people crammed into the black parts of town, you in effect said to people in Roseland or Inglewood, sorry, had to let you go.
Bye.
Bye. And this was also accompanied by terrible violence around public housing, because cities, in many places in the country, when they saw that the private market wasn't building new housing, they built housing with federal funds, with state help often. But in Chicago, even the new public housing developments after the war were coded black and white. And when black GIs, I mean people who had been in uniform a year ago fighting side by side with these people to defeat Hitler and Hirohito, they had won the war and came home and found that their cars were smashed and their living room windows were broken, and they were run out of these new public housing developments unless they were developments built specifically for black tenants.
That was perfectly okay.
That was perfectly fine.
Yeah, it's pretty terrible what you describe in terms of just the way it all worked together and the opportunities that were missed, and how integration became this sort of ideal that wasn't realistic.
Well, we're ready to toss it aside, I think, and that's fine for a lot of people because they're able to toss it aside and say to themselves, whew, I never really even had to try it. But now we can just sort of say, well, we did that and it didn't work, and move on. We missed a lot of opportunities, all during the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And in the process, did a lot of damage to the cities, which often were unwitting stages on which these social dramas were being played out. They didn't volunteer for the job. It just ended up that way. And often they had leadership, certainly in Chicago, as someone who
Yes.
remembers the Elder Daily.
Yes,
they were urban chief executives who were in there mixing it up and making plans and drawing maps, and they were part of the problem, too.
We only have a couple minutes, so maybe talking about how things are changing now, what are the solutions to that problem, I guess?
Well, I think the worst is over.
Mm-hmm.
Part of the reason the worst is over, it's not a happy reason, but part of the reason the worst is over is pretty much everybody who wants to be out of the city is out. So it's like choosing up, it's choosing up to play a schoolyard game, and you look around and now you know who you have to play with.
Yeah.
Detroit's never going to have 2 million people again.
Right.
Chicago's never going to have 3 million people again. That's it.
Right.
So now we're dealing with cities that aren't having huge drops in population. There's a stable stock of people who have made the affirmative decision. I want to live here. They're both rich people, poor people. It's tougher for people in the middle.
Yeah.
The middle class has had a tough time because they feel that rich people can replace all the services that they don't get from cities, so they can live anywhere. Poor people have no choice, so they're stuck in place. Middle class people have more mobility than poor people, but they don't have as much money as rich people to use to buy all the things that they're not getting from their city government.
You talk a lot too about how when rich people complain, it's their right. When poor people complain, it's, you know,
Yeah, where'd they get the nerve?
How dare they?
Yeah, really.
So, but anyway, well, thank you, Ray. This has really been great. Great book.
Thank
really,
you.
really on target. Well, it's a healthy drive back from our suburban studio to the city, so we'll let Ray go now. Many thanks to NPR's Ray Suarez for joining me in the coffee house. Again, his new book is The Old Neighborhood, What We Lost in the Great Migration. I'm Lisa Page, and this has been Writer's Block.
That's it for the June edition. See you next month in the Coffee House.